Greetings, my English 102 students. So, for today's rapid recap, let's talk a bit about scholarly sources. But before we do that, I'm going to do a couple quick reminders. So, as mentioned before, we are going to have your multimodal presentations next week, and we're going to do sign-ups for those on Thursday, and we'll talk a little bit more about those then as well. For this week's assignment, you have a 800-word paper with 2 scholarly sources and at least 1 primary source, but again, feel free to go longer or use more sources if you like. The main thing you're looking for is multiple perspectives. So those perspectives can be ones that disagree with each other if you like, or they can be, different perspectives on the same issue. So for example, we talk about global warming. A homeowner in Florida worried about flooding would have a different perspective than a homeowner in Alaska worried about their home sinking into the melting tundra. Now, with this article, one of the big things we're checking for this week is that you're able to differentiate scholarly sources from secondary or primary sources. And because we haven't had as much time to work with this yet, it is totally okay if your paper is delayed a bit. I know some folks are working on catching up on stuff. And so if you are working on prior assignments, it is okay to go ahead and knock those out first and then come back to this one. All right. Like I said before, we've got the multimodal presentations next week. I have jury duty the following week, and so that following week is a great time for catching up on this article in particular. So let's talk scholarly sources. As I mentioned in class, the thing that differentiates a scholarly source from primary or secondary is that a scholarly source has been through the peer review process. Right? The peer review process requires that that source is written and researched by an academic researcher. So for example, someone like me with a PhD, I could write an academic article. That article then gets sent out to an academic journal. The academic journal will have an editor who sends the article to 2 reviewers. Now, as I mentioned in class, someone like me, I don't have the qualifications to be a peer reviewer because I am not sufficiently published. I'm not established in the field. And so the individuals who are doing those reviews are folks who have been publishing typically for a decade or more. They often are tenured professors, but not always. They can be medical researchers, they could be lawyers with extensive experience. These are individuals who are experts in their field. And so with the peer review process, the editor from that journal will send the article out to 2 reviewers, reviewer 1, reviewer 2. And those 2 reviewers will independently evaluate the article. And they have 3 different responses they can give. 1, this article looks good, we can go ahead and publish it as is. The second is, this article is almost there, we can publish it with some revisions. And the last one is, this article is not of sufficient quality, we can't publish it. Typically an academic journal will have an acceptance rate somewhere between 10 and 30%. So out of the 10 articles sent, they might only accept 1, maybe 2 or 3. Now, by the time a scholarly article is published, a number of years have passed. And so this actually creates one of the challenges with a scholarly article. You're talking about, the researcher may have started grad school like 10 years ago. They're going through grad school, 3-4 years, then they start writing an article following their interests. Might take another 2 or 3 years to get it written. Then they send it to peer review. That peer review process takes another year or 2. And so by the time a scholarly article is actually published, the person publishing it is writing about things they cared about 10 years ago. And so because of this, if your topic is something very recent, you may not find academic sources that cover that specific angle about your topic. Right? So if we were talking about global warming, for example, There probably won't be any scholarly sources that specifically reference the fact that insurance companies are pulling out of the state of Florida because they can't afford to insure homes that may be flooded or are very likely to be flooded by hurricanes and such. And so we'll talk a bit more about what to do in those situations. But the most important thing is that when you're finding these scholarly sources, they do not necessarily need to be exactly right for your specific writing. Okay? So as long as your scholarly source is about your topic, and as long as it has information you can tie back to your topic, you are good for English 102. Something to bear in mind for English 102 is that this class is not a class in your major typically, unless you happen to be an English major. My job is not to test whether or not you can write an academic article ready for peer review. I'm not looking for perfection. My job is to make sure that you know the difference between a secondary and a scholarly source. And so as long as you are using scholarly sources and showing that you know what they are, then you are doing fine for English 102. Now, with that, let's quickly cover a few of the things to watch out for with sources that may appear to be scholarly but actually aren't. So the first is that there are many excellent secondary sources out there that may sound scholarly. So for example, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, Slate, Rolling Stone, all of those are excellent secondary sources. They may be some of the best sources you can find, period. In fact, some of them may be better than some of the scholarly sources out there, especially for these newer issues that have not made it through peer review yet. But they're not peer reviewed, and so they're not scholarly. All right, they're not intended to be scholarly. Like I said, they are great sources. They're just not going to cut it for understanding what a scholarly source is. The second thing to be aware of is that there are some academic journals out there that don't actually use a peer review process. Some of these are actually called vanity journals. And so the way they work is that an academic scholar will write a paper, send it in, and then pay a $100 processing fee to get published. All right, so that is not peer review, that is pay to play. Legitimate scholarly journals, most of their funding may come from university funding or federal funding, especially for medical journals, or those very high subscription fees. So if you see an academic article locked behind a $30 paywall, this is how those academic journals earn the money to actually run the peer review process. Bear in mind that academic journals typically only have 1,000 readers, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 at most. Some only have a few hundred, and so this is why actually part of why they are considered so reliable, is that they are not targeting larger audiences. They are not trying to make a profit by any means. And so when we're talking about, say, the CRAP test, when we're looking at P for purpose, this is part of what differentiates a scholarly source from a secondary source. Most secondary sources are trying to reach the largest audience possible, whereas most scholarly sources are trying to present the best information possible for that field. And so with a secondary source, they are rewarded by the number of people reading it and the number of people paying to read it. Whereas a scholarly source, they are rewarded based on how well other scholars view that article. And when those scholarly sources are viewed as being of high quality, they're more likely to receive grants from universities. They are more likely to receive federal funding or things like that. Now, another thing we have not yet covered is that there are some cases where people have abused the peer review system. And so I'm going to talk about a case on another day where, a physician essentially fabricated some of his data results to imply that MMR vaccines cause autism, whereas in reality, he was being funded by personal injury attorneys who wanted to sue the vaccine manufacturers, right? And so this researcher basically gamed the system. He got through peer review by writing an article that looked like it was well researched. It convinced the peer reviewers that this was something worth publishing, and in reality, it was a fraud. And so we'll be talking more about how that works and how to watch out for those things. Now, ironically enough, one way to check for whether an article is scholarly or not is to check if the academic journal has a Wikipedia article. Right? The Wikipedia articles will accurately tell you if the journal is peer-reviewed or not. It will also tell you the reputation it has and things like that. If a journal does not have a Wikipedia page, or the Wikipedia page says this is a vanity journal, then there is a strong chance that this is not a reputable scholarly source. Now, the last thing I want to point out with scholarly sources is that they are considered the gold standard in terms of reliability, but they are also the hardest to find and the hardest to work with. Right? There are fewer of these sources than there are of others. They tend to be written with very academic language, a lot of jargon, a lot of information you may not be familiar with. It is not my expectation that you completely understand your scholarly sources. Right? For English 102, my expectation is that you are able to find them, you are able to review them, and you are able to do something with them. Even if you are struggling with them, it is completely okay to admit that in your paper. So, for example, you could say something like, this scholarly source says this, I take it to mean this, but I'm not sure about what X means in this article. That, to me, is responsible research. English 102 is not about producing an academic article for peer review, right? That is not an expectation for this course. My expectation is simply that you're learning what a scholarly source is, you're able to properly identify them, and you're able to draw relevant quotes from them, even if that article is not specifically about your precise focus for your paper. So with that, please let me know of any questions. As always, with articles like this, if you have quick questions, especially as you're doing the writing, please send a text so I can reply faster. Otherwise, if you have longer questions, or you're gonna just need some extra time on this article, go ahead and send me an email to let me know. And with that, I will see you guys in a couple days on Thursday.